In 325, their main issue was the Greek word homoousios versus homoiousios. Homo, same essence. Jesus was the same essence of the Father. Homoi, no, he was just a similar essence, but it was actually different. I want to talk about the Acts, page 12, of Theodosius. He was the last emperor to rule both East and West. He was the last guy who was truly significant as an emperor. There were other emperors, but as you'll see, we're discussing that the empire began crumbling. He was the first emperor to be baptized in the name of the Trinity, 380 A.D. He made Nicene Christianity the only recognized religion of the empire. He worked hard to suppress Arianism and paganism. Let me pause and say that when Constantine had his new city built called Constantinople, it was a brand new city, and he had several reasons for building it and moving the headquarters of the empire there from Rome. One of those was that Rome was covered with pagan temples. And they had, in all the ceremonies and all, there was all this pagan stuff, and the pagan priests came and they did whatever. And see, the emperor was head over all the religions, the pagan religions as well as Christianity. So, he said, we'll build a new city, and of course he named it after himself. He's a nice, humble fellow. And it won't have any pagan temples. And now when you have the emperor's procession down the street, we won't even invite a bunch of pagan kooks over there. We'll invite my paid staff, my personal bishops that obey me just like I was God. And so he had a lot of reasons for building a new city. And it was, from all accounts, it was really a magnificent place. And later when we talk about the Council of Chalcedon, it was right across the strait. If you look at your little map, where it says Constantinople there, where these two land masses meet, there's just a little itty-bitty place there. Well, that's about 2 miles across. And Constantinople's on one side, and across and down about 2 miles and across is Chalcedon. Okay? And so the idea is when the pagans came in, and I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about the barbarians, when they came in and started tearing up the empire, they took Chalcedon, and right over there was Constantinople, the headquarters of the empire. And so the emperor comes out every day and looks and goes, oh my Lord, the barbarians are at the gates. They're right there, you know, they're right over there. And so it's quite exasperating if you're trying to be the world ruler and the people are tearing up your empire. He forbids heretics and schismatics the right to meet, 381. Well, in 325, you thought when they legalized Christianity and all, you thought, boy, these are the good old days. No, the only Christianity legalized is whatever the government approved. And of course, there were a lot of people who didn't like that. 390, Theodosius the emperor repents for 8 months and submits publicly to Bishop Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. And if you remember, they moved the headquarters from Rome up to Milan, north of Rome. And 391, they made pagan worship illegal. 392, the seizure and closure. They closed down all the pagan temples. But notice at the bottom of our page, hordes of barbarians migrated into the empire between 375 and 1066. So what you had is the Roman Empire was all this area here, including Britain, and all of a sudden, all these Germanic tribes and the Goths and all these people are coming in from every direction because the whole empire began to collapse. What they did is overextended themselves, right? And so it says here, 378 in Adrianople was the first major battle that the Roman armies ever lost. And that's a big deal because it signals the defeat of the empire. They had told the people, we are here by God's command. We rule you by God's command. We have wonderful laws of justice by God's command. We're here as God's ambassadors, and God protects us, and we can't be defeated. And so you can imagine the shudder of fear that went through the whole countryside when they said, the Roman army just got beat. They got their pants kicked. They got their behind kicked. They were slaughtered out there. It was really terrible. And people go, oh my Lord, if they're not keeping these wild barbarians like Attila the Hun and these people, if they're not keeping them out, who's going to keep them out? Now you have to understand that these barbarians, they didn't want to come down and tear up something and go home. They weren't fighting a war over a tax or an issue. They wanted somewhere to live. They were poor. You know, they were lucky to get a meal every day. They just were scratching along and had a hard life. And they said, look, there's beautiful cities, chariots and horses and stallions prancing in the streets and dancing girls in the bars. This is, whoa! We need to go over there and live. And so the barbarians, they weren't looking at it as a place to go steal some stuff. They looked at it as, man, let's load up all of our cousins and everything and just have a big caravan and go down there and move into one of these nice Roman cities and set up a business of some sort. But of course they were, you know, bloodthirsty, and to them, if they didn't like what you did, they would cut your throat. And so the Roman people were living under very strict law. They didn't want these people moving in by any stretch of the imagination. Now in the Western Empire, here's the Western Empire, there's the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire, they decided to assimilate these people, help them, try and get them settled in, teach them about our laws. And in the West, they didn't make it so friendly, and so in the West, they just came down and slaughtered people and set up camp right there. And so they came down this way and came across here and went into northern Africa. And this went on year after year. It just progressed. Amen? So, page 13, the top of the page. Rome was sacked. They took the city of Rome in 410. Italy, Gaul, and Spain were ruined by Attila the Hun before he was repelled in 451. From 429 to 439, the Vandals were taking North Africa. Britain was invaded by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in 450. And so what we see is major portions of the Roman Empire being taken over. You can imagine they took Britain. Now when the Romans took Britain, they found that the people there were hostile. And there are rumors, I assume they must be true, that the people were cannibals and everything. They were just mean. They lived in the forests like animals, and they were, you know, voodooistic and all kinds of crazy spiritism and stuff. And they would, you know, cut your throat, drink your blood, and eat your leg for dinner tonight. And so ultimately they weren't able to deal with them, and so the British built a huge wall to separate, you know, where the wild barbarians are out there from their cities. Well, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, they're not interested in a bunch of crazy heathen out in the woods. We want that city over there. We want these places here where they've got the farm all set up over there. We could take that, we could do something with that. And so, what happened was the empire was just like a big monster was eating. If you had a huge family-sized chocolate chip cookie, and the monster is just eating pieces and taking it. And so the Roman Empire is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now in the east, over there, everything's coming out of Constantinople, and they're working it a lot smoother, and so they're assimilating a bunch of these barbarians, and it's changing the nature of everything they were doing, but they are assimilating them. And so after the collapse of Rome and the Roman Empire, they called the East the Byzantine Empire. They didn't call the West anything because it was just all screwed up. Barbarians and crazy people running around, and law and order had fallen apart, and it's just mayhem. And so what it amounted to is you had wealthy landowners set up an area that they could protect that was their land, and they hired a knight to come and fight for them, or several, and had other men that were, able to do war. And so they did farming, but they also had a little private army. They had their own church, their own bishop. It's like a little city compound of sorts. And the only issue was a lot of them didn't like the government having told them who could be their bishop and who couldn't, and if they could remove him and if they couldn't. And so now you enter into a time in history when the landowner, the baron and the baroness, they ruled over a little bitty kingdom. It might only be, 300 or 400 or 500 acres or something, but they ruled that little thing. And outside of that, it was like the wild woods and stuff. Right? You remember Robin Hood and all those crazy shows?
Pride and Prejudice.
Well, the churches of the Pride and Prejudice. The church, well, it is true. If you remember the show Pride and Prejudice, they hired the boy to be their pastor. The churches of the